Hello, Andrew Bell here. In this short video clip, we're going to look at the conclusions, the limitations, the recommendations, and further work for master's dissertations. So, 4 things we're going to look at. The conclusions chapter for your master's dissertation, talk about the limitations, and what the difference is between the recommendations and further work. So first of all, let's look at the conclusions. And the most important thing in the conclusion chapter is there is nothing new here. You're just repeating what you've stated throughout the dissertation. So certainly nothing that's got citations, nothing that's referenced, no new material in the conclusions chapter. Now remember that perhaps your master's dissertation has got a second assessor or a second supervisor or a moderator or an external examiner, and what they might do to judge the quality of your work is they might just read the abstract, the introduction and the conclusion chapter. That should give them a good feel for the work. So I think it's really important that conclusion can stand by itself. So no new material. It's going to summarise the work that you've done. Now the biggest tip I can give you for the conclusions chapter is to repeat the objectives word for word, absolutely identical. The objectives that you stated in chapter 1, repeat them in the conclusion chapter. And what you're going to do in the conclusion chapter is you're going to tell me if that objective was fully met, partially met, or not met at all. It's okay not to meet an objective as long as you can talk about why the objective wasn't met. So was that objective fully met? Where was it fully met? Where in the dissertation can I find evidence that this objective has been met? Has that come out of the literature review? Was that stated in the research methodology chapter? Has that come out of the analysis of questionnaires? Has that come out of the discussion chapter? So for each objective, and remember I suggested that you may have 6 to 9 objectives in a separate video. For each objective, you might expand to become a paragraph or half a page explaining if the objective was met, how it was met, and where in the dissertation I can see that. So this is the biggest reason that I complain about dissertation conclusions, is that there's no reference back to the original objectives. In fact, many marking schemes are looking for that. Does this reflect back to the original objectives? So the second thing that needs to be right at the end of your dissertation is something about the limitations. What were the limitations of your research? You can say you were limited by time, and maybe time has stopped you doing deeper research or finding more case studies. Maybe a visit to your case study company is impractical because of time or budget. So it's limiting your ability to do a good research. Maybe you were limited in access to people to interview. Maybe people cancelled their interviews, important people. Maybe you didn't get enough questionnaire responses, and that is a limitation on your work. What you're doing is you're clearly saying that your research isn't perfect here, and you know what the limitations are. Maybe you're limited to looking at only English language papers. That's a very good and generic limitation that academics often put in. Maybe you're looking at a Western society, a Western culture, rather than an African or an Asian culture, and that's the viewpoint that's limiting your research. Thirdly and fourthly, we're going to look at the difference between recommendations and further work. Recommendations are something that you're going to do as a direct result of your research. What's going to change? And they're aimed at the situation that your research is done, the client or the company if you've done it for a particular company. Whereas the further work is looking at things that haven't been researched yet. So it's not a recommendation because it's something you've discovered. It's something that you think, well, actually, this needs a bit more work done on it. And it's aimed at other students and other academics that they can look at in the future. So the recommendations, as a result of this research, you suggesting that something needs to change, something needs to be implemented. Maybe you suggest that something is communicated or published more widely. You're suggesting, you're recommending what needs to change as a result of your research dissertation. The further work is identified research that you have not done. It could be some research findings that were not part of your original objectives. Something that's cropped up in the literature review that you thought, hey, hang on, this is odd. These people aren't agreeing with each other on this topic. But it's not part of your objectives to find out why. But it's something that somebody else could do in the future. So it could be some incompleteness or limitation of your research that means that somebody else could carry it on and go further in it. So very briefly, we've looked at what should be in the conclusion chapter for your master's dissertation. Repeat the objectives is the number one tip. Comment on, were the objectives met? How were they met? Where in the dissertation can I see that they have been met? Talk about the limitations of your research. What are the limitations? What prevents your research being perfect? Suggest recommendations. From your research, recommendations can be made. And suggest further work that could be done that wasn't part of your original research, but your research is suggesting it can be done. And those four things, don't leave it to the end of your dissertation. As you're doing your literature review, start making notes. Oh, this is something that perhaps is meeting my objectives. Oh, this is something that I could talk about as potential further research because it doesn't help my objectives. This is a recommendation that I want to make. So start adding notes into these sections right from the start of your research writing process, and then this will be an easier section to write. Thank you for listening.